Hello and good morning. This is the presentation for Brain-Based Learning Group A. The creators were Marla, myself, Michaela, and Mary. And let's get started. This is the table of contents that just explains the sections that we've divided this into. So the first section is the scenario, which we'll go through in a minute. Section 2 kind of details adolescent brain development, normal development, and section 3 talks about how adolescent brains develop in autism spectrum disorder. Section 4 will address ASD social development, and section 5 will address ASD academic development. So here's the case study we're going to be looking at this morning. This case study is based on a real student that I taught in my class, but obviously I have renamed him for privacy. Charlie is a 7th grader who hasn't been formally diagnosed as ASD. His parents will not allow testing, and that's for a variety of personal reasons. They do not believe that he has ASD, even though they have had him, he has participated in occupational therapy and he's been advised by the school. They've been advised by the school numerous times to have him tested. In general, Charlie is friendly and eager to please his teachers and peers, but he does struggle to make appropriate eye contact. He dresses in clothes that are about 2 sizes too small for him, and he has kind of an awkward gait when he walks and runs. Most of Charlie's deficits are social. He really wants to connect with his peers, but he often ends up just annoying them instead. And he can't tell whether peers are laughing with him or laughing at him. So he sometimes participates in situations and conversations in which his peers are making fun of him. Sometimes he knows it and sometimes he doesn't know. Academically, Charlie does well. He makes A's in science and math. He does require a little more time than his classmates to grasp math concepts. And he does struggle with written expression, although he reads really well and he has a good vocabulary. So his deficits in written expression are not due to his inability to read or acquire new vocabulary. Charlie does have an issue with his handwriting. It's almost illegible. It takes him a long time to write anything, and even after he writes it, it's pretty messy. And Charlie's special interest in reptiles. He has 35 lizards at his house, lizards and snakes, and he loves to talk about that. If ever you allow him to do a project, he wants to do it on reptiles, so that's his special interest. Before we get started, let's talk about normal adolescent brain development. So what you would expect to see in a typically developing 7th or 8th grader. Adolescence is the phase of life between late childhood and adulthood. So this is when kids are turning from a child to an adult. It's kind of a middle time. The brain develops really quickly in the first 3 to 5 years of life, and all the kind of structures are there by the age of 9. But the different centers of the brain develop and become functionally connected over time, and the last part of the brain to mature is the prefrontal lobe. And a lot of growth in the prefrontal lobe happens during adolescence, although it continues into early adulthood. And a lot of things affect the brain development in the frontal lobe, including genetics and individual and environmental factors. So as stated here, important structural changes of the brain are always taking place well into adolescence and into early adulthood and even beyond. Except for a few sensitive periods for vision, hearing, and language learning, the brain is capable of growth well into adulthood. And an important part of that growth, the prefrontal cortex development, is happening just before puberty and as kids go through their teen years. In normal development, 95% of the brain is developed by the age of 5. but studies have shown that the prefrontal cortex continues to develop, as we talked about earlier. And the prefrontal cortex is important because it's responsible for planning, working memory, organization, modulating mood, also predicting outcomes, critical thinking. And as this prefrontal cortex matures, teenagers are increasingly able to reason, and they develop more control over their impulses and hopefully develop better judgment. So these are just some key points to remember about adolescence and their brain development. Teenagers really need to have a safe environment where they have consistent support and in order for their brains to develop optimally. And along with that, having an adult who talks to them as they're growing up really helps that brain development. Additionally, having an adult who can model appropriate emotional responses and make sure to acknowledge what the teen is feeling and help them process what they're feeling is really important for that social development. Teens really need adults who believe in them and encourage them. They respond much better to rewards than punishment, so that's something for adults and teachers to keep in mind. And while teens do need clear, consistent boundaries, they're kind of in a middle space between needing boundaries and needing space to become more independent because they are developing their own personalities and their own sense of self. So in ASD, the brain develops a bit differently. There's really no known cause for autism spectrum disorder. It's kind of generally accepted that it's caused by abnormalities in brain structure and function, and there are also some genetic abnormalities or differences between kids who have ASD and kids who don't. But in general, brain scans show some differences in brain symmetry, in the amount of pruning that takes place, neural pruning, and the amount of connectivity between parts of the brain. So going along with that, kids with ASD do show an abnormal amount of brain symmetry. And researchers are not exactly sure why this has an effect on their behavior, but brains that are more symmetrical in general have been associated with kids who have dyslexia and also people who have schizophrenia. So it's actually not normal to have each side of your brain be exactly the same. Most people rely more heavily on the right side of their brain, but the right side of the hemisphere is less well developed in kids with ASD. So this means that a person with autism is more likely to use both sides of their brain evenly, and it actually results in impaired ability to put together information into kind of a fully integrated picture. And as Marla has stated here, it kind of explains why Charlie's unable to put together the fact that kids at school are actually making fun of him. They're not laughing with him, they're laughing at him. And he's really not able to kind of take in all the signals and put it together and understand what's actually happening to him. There's also a lack of pruning that happens in the brain. So babies experience the growth of millions of new synapses after birth, and that kind of continues through early childhood. But the brain has to undergo a major pruning of these synapses during adolescence. And if they do not prune, this is a great quote by a researcher. He says, "You have to lose some connections in order to develop a fine-tuned system of brain networks, because if all the parts of the brain talk to each other, all you get is noise." So this overabundance of synapses actually causes the brain to be just firing in a lot of different unconnected ways instead of having just specific pathways. And this kind of explains why kids with ASD can be really overstimulated by a lot of change or a lot of just environmental noise. In addition, it's both like it's both a there's too much connection through the lack of pruning, but there's also too little connection. Um, and autistic brains show a lack of myelination, which is the fatty tissue that surrounds each neuron and helps neurons to communicate with each other really quickly. Um, in addition to that, genes related to synaptic function, so information sharing between neural brain cells, are lower than typical. And this is a great quote from Genetic Engineering and Biotechnology News. Myelination is essential to healthy brain development. It's a process that begins before birth and continues throughout the lifespan. If impaired, it leads to abnormal brain development that likely results in some of the communication and behavior challenges associated with ASD. So while kids have too many synapses, they're actually underconnected as well. As stated before, even though Charlie's parents will not allow him to be tested, it can be really helpful for his teachers and other adults in his life to kind of see his behavior in a framework that can help them better understand his brain and what can be done to assist him. So this is a list of the DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for autism spectrum, and you can see that most of Charlie's issues are social, but he does definitely fall under this criteria. He has a difficult time with social approaches. He has a hard time understanding eye contact and nonverbal communication. And he definitely has a hard time with social interactions and back and forth conversations, as well as his attachment to lizards. He's got that really obvious kind of special interest. As far as social development in normal teens, the middle school years are really important. And according to Erik Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, adolescents are in stage 5, which is where they're trying to figure out what their identity is, or they're having role confusion. So this stage lasts from about age 12 to age 18, and students in this age are trying to figure out who they are, independent of their families, and where they fit in society. And a primary way this happens is through the establishment of peer groups and social relationships. So social skills are absolutely essential during this period of time. Typical adolescents are kind of impulsive because they're experimenting with how to interact with peers and adults. They're more influenced by outside factors than they used to be. So even though they're still connected to their families and their families still matter, but friends, social groups, societal norms, pop culture, and schoolmates are becoming more important and more of an influence. Similarly, they're becoming a little bit less concerned with the input of immediate family, although, as I said, the supportive family plays a really important role. And they're trying to establish their identity by figuring out where they belong. So finding a social group, developing some good friendships, and figuring out how they feel about themselves. In the same way, normal adolescents are developing a theory of mind. So they're figuring out a bunch of different things about how to relate to other people. And this is just a few of those ways. They're coming to understand the beliefs of others and perceive the feelings of others. They're starting to be able to imagine what others may be thinking and empathize with them. They are starting to realize that other people have different points of view that are not necessarily the same as their own. And importantly, in the conversational piece, they're figuring out how to bid for other people's attention. So how to get into a conversation, and then how to give and take during that conversation. And then lastly, they're kind of developing a sense of why others may react the way they do. And they're learning how to figure out if a social situation is not going well, how they can repair that interaction and behave in a way that's socially appropriate. In ASD, a lot of the social development is impaired. And in Charlie's case, this is definitely